In the vast landscape of Roman civilization where emperors forged empires and legions marched in perfect rhythm, there existed customs far older than Rome itself. Customs that belonged not to marble temples or polished politics, but to the shadowed world where the living still feared the dead. Among these ancient traditions, one stood out in its haunting intensity. A wedding night ritual so disturbing, so psychologically wrenching, and so deeply symbolic that later Romans tried to bury all traces of it. It was not a punishment, nor merely a tradition. It was a ritual of transformation, humiliation, purification, and submission. A ritual that forced a new bride to leave behind her identity in the most brutal way imaginable, so she could become a Roman wife in the eyes of gods and men. And that ritual, whispered only in fragments in forgotten texts, was known as the breaking of the bride. To understand why this wedding night rite existed, one must understand what marriage meant to the earliest Romans. It was not romance. It was not partnership. It was a complete annihilation of one identity and the forced birth of another. A Roman bride was not simply joining a new household, she was undergoing a spiritual death. She was leaving behind her family, her gods, her ancestral spirits, her social identity, and even her name. When a bride entered her husband's home, she symbolically died as a daughter of one house and was reborn as a daughter to another. A transformation so radical that the Romans believed it could only be achieved through a violent symbolic act. The ritual began during the daylight ceremony, when the bride appeared dressed in the flammeum, the flame-colored veil that signaled both purity and sacrifice. The fiery orange color was deliberately chosen to resemble the torch of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, signaling that the bride would soon be kindled into a new life, like wood thrown into a sacred flame. Her shoes matched her veil, bright yellow, the color of ripened wheat, a reminder that a woman's destiny was to nourish her household. These elements were innocent enough, but what came next was not. As the bride stood waiting, her hair was divided into 6 braids using a bent spearhead, the same type of spear that had once killed an enemy of Rome. Historians understand the symbolism clearly. Marriage was a conquest. Marriage was a battle. Marriage was the submission of one life to another. The spear symbolized that the bride was being claimed by the same force that conquered nations. And once her hair was divided, her transformation from woman to wife, from individual to property, officially began. When the wedding procession ended and the bride reached her new husband's home, she found the door barred. This was part of the ritual, for she was never meant to enter willingly. The bridesmaids pretended to plead for her entry, and the groom pretended to hesitate. But the entire performance led to a single brutal moment. She was lifted bodily from the ground and carried across the threshold. Roman tradition claimed this reenacted the legendary abduction of the Sabine women, but deeper meanings lurked beneath the surface. The threshold was sacred, guarded by spirits who despised death. And since the bride was symbolically dying to her old life, she could not be allowed to touch it. So she was carried like a corpse. What happened next, once the feast ended and the lamplight dimmed, formed the heart of the ritual Rome tried to erase. For the moment the bride and groom entered the bridal chamber, they were not alone. Parents, relatives, priests, and attendants lingered nearby, not to witness the consummation directly, but to oversee the ritual that preceded it, the ritual intended to break the bride's connection to her past. The chamber itself was prepared with haunting precision. A small stool was placed near the bed. A sheepskin lay beside it, symbolizing fertility but also sacrifice. A wooden torch, unlit, stood against the wall. These were not decorations, they were tools. The first act was simple yet profoundly symbolic. The bride was instructed to sit on the sheepskin, forcing her to lower herself toward the ground. This posture was humiliating by design. It was the same posture peasants adopted when offering homage to a master. By sitting on it, the bride acknowledged that she too was being stripped of everything she had ever been. The groom then approached with the torch. Its meaning was unmistakable. Fire was the power of Vesta, the power of purification. The groom touched the unlit torch to the bride's forehead, not to burn her, but to mark her. This gesture was said to separate her spiritually from her previous household. It was as though he were telling the gods, "This woman no longer belongs to the spirits of her father. She now belongs to mine." But the ritual turned harsher. Once the bride was marked, she was commanded to rise and perform a gesture Romans called manus. This was the root of the phrase marriage by manus, in which a bride legally passed under her husband's hand literally. For in this ritual, the groom placed his right hand firmly on the bride's head, not gently, not tenderly, but with the pressure of dominance, as one would place a hand on the head of a captured enemy. That one gesture changed her legal identity. She no longer belonged to her father's household. She was now legally the daughter of her husband. His ancestors became her ancestors, his gods became her gods. She had no rights over property, no independent standing in the eyes of the law. She had been consumed by a new family. With the bride standing under her husband's hand, an older woman, often a relative of the groom, stepped forward with a small loaf of bread. This bread was not ordinary. It was made from the first grain of the harvest, baked in a clay oven shaped by ritual. The matrona broke the bread in half. One half was handed to the groom. The other half was held tightly before the bride. But the bride could not take it yet. She had to speak a vow first, a vow that translated roughly to, "Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia." It did not matter if the groom's name was Gaius. It was a formula, a declaration that she was becoming a reflection of him. The bride repeated the words, and only then was she permitted to touch the bread, but she could not simply take it. The matrona pressed the bread so firmly against the bride's hands that it broke, crumbling between her fingers. This was not an accident. It was meant to symbolize the breaking of her ties to her family, her broken identity. She ate some of the crumbs. The groom did the same. And with that, bride and groom were said to be bound by fate. Then came the final, most disturbing part of the breaking. The older woman, sometimes multiple women, surrounded the bride and began to remove her bridal ribbons, the knots that held her veil and gown together. These knots were tied in a special way called the knot of Hercules. Only the groom could untie them fully, but the attendants loosened the outer layers, leaving the bride half-veiled, half-unbound, and utterly vulnerable. This state of partial undressing represented that she was no longer fully protected by her father's house but not yet fully claimed by her husband's. She existed in a liminal state between past and future, between maiden and wife. The bride was then led to the bed. The torch from earlier was lit and placed nearby, symbolizing her new spiritual identity being ignited. And then, in a haunting act, the groom had to speak a question aloud. A question that later Roman writers found so archaic and barbaric they refused to copy it into public manuscripts. The question has been reconstructed by historians to be something like, "Do you accept the fate of this house?" The bride was expected to answer yes. But even if she hesitated, the ritual continued. Consent was symbolic, not literal. And so the groom sat beside her, placed his hand on her veil, and slowly drew it back. This moment was known as the unveiling, and it was said to reveal the bride not just to her husband but to the gods of his household, the ancestral spirits who watched over the family. She was exposed to them, judged by them, claimed by them. The women in the chamber then withdrew. The parents stepped back. Only the groom remained, but even then, the ritual was not complete. For the final act was a gesture Romans kept secret. It involved a small wooden tablet hidden beneath the bed, carved with symbols representing the bride's new lineage. Before consummation, the groom took this tablet and placed it against the bride's stomach. It was believed that this would bind her future children to his family's bloodline. And once the tablet was placed, the breaking was complete. The bride had died, the wife was born. What followed, the consummation itself, was considered a private affair, but it was a confirmation to the gods that the ritual had been completed. The torch burned beside the bed until dawn, symbolizing the flame of the household accepting its new member. When morning came, the bride rose with a new name, a new legal status, and a new identity. Yet as centuries passed, the ritual began to fade. The rise of a more lenient free marriage model made many of the breaking traditions seem cruel and primitive. Educated Romans wanted nothing to do with such rituals. Emperors in the imperial era banned parts of it outright. And as Christianity rose, the idea of symbolically killing a bride to create a wife became intolerable. Thus the ritual disappeared. Not openly erased, but quietly forgotten. Today we remember Rome for its emperors, its legions, and its gladiators. But rarely do we look into the hidden world of its domestic rituals. The world where power was exercised not through war, but through symbols designed to control lives. The breaking of the bride was one such ceremony. It was psychological, spiritual, and haunting. And it was a ritual Rome tried desperately to hide because it revealed far too clearly the darkness at the heart of Roman family life. In a world that worshipped discipline and conquest, Even marriage became an arena of domination. The bride's wedding night marked not the beginning of love, but the end of freedom. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into Rome's hidden past interesting, be sure to subscribe for more stories from the shadows of history.